You're watching Unlocking the Vault on Mtgo Academy, featuring Enderfall.
Alright everyone, here is the deck tech for the Stax deck that I've piloted in the most recent daily event. The reason why I wanted to play this deck in the daily event is to try and figure out whether or not non-affinity workshop is still viable. Pretty much everybody is immediately came to the conclusion that the restrictions of Spear of Resistance and Lowstone Golem just kind of put the deck into into a situation where it just really wasn't good enough anymore. And while to an extent losing those 6 cards are really a core part of the deck, there was a part of me that said, you know, those 6 cards were good, but there's probably 6 cards that we could add that maybe aren't, 100% of a replacement, but maybe 75% or something like that, that could still be powerful enough to really get going. And so there was 2 decks that, 2 workshop decks that I've been messing around with a little bit in recent weeks. Both of them kind of surprised me, and I think I would play either of them, but I got a little bit more practice with this deck than the other one, even though the other one is a little bit more of a known quantity. I did play this a little bit more in the tournament practice room, so I felt a little bit more comfortable playing this deck tonight, and it's different, so I wanted to try and see if it could hold up over the course of a 4-round event. Obviously, a 4-round event is a good barometer, but not necessarily a perfect barometer. You can easily go 3-1 based off of one positive matchup and one opponent just kind of folding. But I still wanted to figure out whether or not the deck could hold up against other people that are really aiming to win the tournament. So this is what I came up with. The deck is a much more attrition version of workshop, as opposed to the lockdown prison type workshop that pretty much was rampant. Everybody went with that plan. And really the heart of the deck is basically trying to grind out incremental value. Before it was prevent your opponent from casting spells. This is a little bit more of a grind, and the reason for some of the card choices is that you're trying to win the long game, at the same time trying to keep your opponent from taking over the game, so that you can play your artifacts that will eventually take over the game. And really the heart of the engine involves Smokestack and Crucible Worlds. These 2 cards over a period of time provide incremental value, and when combined it's even better. You can, much like Tangle Wire, you can stack the triggers for Smokestack such that while the first turn you play it, it does absolutely nothing. On your following upkeep, you can set the trigger such that the first trigger to resolve is the one that requires you to sacrifice, and the second trigger to resolve is the one that puts a counter on the Smokestack. So much like Tangle Wire, the first person that has to deal with it is your opponent. It's on their second turn, which is one of the reasons why Smokestack isn't really a popular card, but it does this. It is somewhat asymmetrical. And then on your second upkeep, you could stack the triggers again such that you only have to sacrifice one of your own permanents, and then on your opponent's side they have to sacrifice 3. So in that sense it's 3-1, and then on your turn you can sacrifice a smokestack if you're in such a commanding board state, if it was say earlier in the game, but if it's late, or if it's late in the mid to late game, you can keep the permanents chugging, because your deck is full of permanents. There's no card in this deck that does not stay on the battlefield, so you can set up a state where you can keep attritioning out your opponent to the point where you can kind of grind them down, and it works really well with Crucible of Worlds, because Crucible of Worlds lets you make sure that you always have a steady flow of permanents, even if somehow you're in top deck mode. So you can play a land out of your graveyard, one that you maybe even sacrificed during your own upkeep to the smokestack, and keep that engine so that if its smokestack is on 1, your opponent is always losing something and you're net neutral. But you can always combine that with playing artifacts off the top of your deck, or even additional copies of Crucible Worlds. The second Crucible Worlds is obviously redundant, so you can use that those types of situations to bump up the smokestack to 2 and really put the pressure on your opponent. Obviously, that's kind of the gist of the deck, but there is still the prison aspect, and this package here, the Chalice of the Void. So this is what's left. Let me backtrack a little bit. This is what's left of the sphere, if you include Lodestone Golem, of course. But this is what's left of the sphere package. It used to be 13. We now have 6. So, what we're left with is, I'm sorry, we have 7 if you include Lodestone Golem. So what we're left with is singletons of Lodestone Golem, Trinisphere, and Sphere Resistance, and you have a full playset of Thorn of Amethyst. Now, before, you can almost guarantee that you would have 1 to 2 in your opening hand. Now, with only 7, you draw a lot more hands to start out the game where you don't have any, and that's one of the reasons why you can't depend on that package anymore to carry you. You need to do something else to get past the fact that you're no longer going to be able to control the board because your opponents can't play permanents. You need to control the board because your opponents have to get rid of their permanents. So when I went through the process of thinking of what do I replace the 6 cards with, 3 Lodestones and the 3 spheres, obviously if I wanted to go to the sphere package, my article that I wrote immediately after the restrictions, I indicated defense grade as something that was something I wanted to explore. I didn't even bother testing it. I really thought about it after the fact, and it really didn't seem like it was what we wanted to do. Yes, it prevented them from countering your spells, but it really never slowed them down on their turn, and doesn't really affect some of the decks from kind of just ignoring it altogether. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, all right, so what do I want to do? Well, maybe we could go with smokestack. So I just mentioned the smokestack engine for a few minutes there. I thought, yeah, all right, the smokestack engine could probably work. It used to be somewhat powerful in classic decks. It's a little less powerful in classic versus vintage because you can't reliably cast it on turn 1 all the time when it's really going to be at its best. Casting it on turn 2 is really tough, especially when you're on the draw, because your opponent gets 3 full turns before this card that you played on your second turn does anything. And that's a huge difference between classic and vintage, where you can play Workshop in a Mox and you got Smokestack on turn 1. Even on the draw, that's still a pretty powerful engine. they have to start sacrificing things on turn 2 instead of turn 4, and that's a huge difference. So I knew I needed to find 2 more cards to fill in the slots that kind of were earmarked for that. And funny thing happened. I was looking through my collection a couple weeks ago, looking at cards that I was looking to unload as I was trying to build up a pile of tickets for upcoming Vintage Masters. And I looked at my collection and I saw, well, I got these 2 Winter Orbs. I never used them. Maybe I should just sell them. And then it dawned on me, Winter Orb is a really good replacement for Sphere of Resistance. And it kind of goes to what I played in my last deck in the last article that I had the video, Back to Basics. Winter Orb doesn't completely lock things down like Back to Basics does, but what Winter Orb can do is really limit what your opponent is able to do. And if you can cast Winter Orb when they are tapped out, it's really powerful. But even if it's not a situation where your opponent is already tapped out, it still has a lot of value because it changes the way they think about making plays. They always have to be cognizant of the fact that if they do tap out to play something, they have to deal with the Winter Orb, or they're going to be stuck untapping only 1 land a turn. And when you combine that with Wastelands, which also combine well with multiple Crucible Worlds in the deck, but if you combine that with Wastelands, if they untap 1 land in their upkeep, you can kill that 1 land with your Wasteland or your Strip Mine before they can get to do anything with it. They have to. The only thing they can do with it is tap it for an instant in their upkeep step, and it really is not really. It's asymmetrical. Obviously, it's made to be symmetrical, but it's asymmetrical for Workshop because most of your lands tap for more than 1 land, more than 1 mana. So when you're untapping only 1 land a turn, that land is usually going to be a City of Traders, an Ancient Tomb, or a Workshop. And that's the reason why this deck plays 4 of each of the City of Traders and the Ancient Tomb, because you want to maximize the value of each card that you untap for Winter Orb. Now, I only have 2 Winter Orbs in this deck. One, because I started with only 2 Winter Orbs in my collection, but the biggest factor is Winter Orb in multiples is redundant. Much like multiple Crucible Worlds are redundant, Winter Orb is a little less flexible in terms of when you want to use it. You almost always want to be able to play Crucible Worlds if you can. Winter Orb, there are going to be instances where you're not going to want to play it. You're either going to want to play something else, or you're going to be tapped out and your opponent is untapped, and playing the Winter Orb is only going to affect you mostly. So Winter Orb as a 2-of is something that I want to see a good amount of time, but I never want to draw multiples, and that's why I have 2 of them. But when I came to the realization that Winter Orb is a kind of a really good substitute for Sphere of Resistance. Obviously it's not the same, but it's a good substitute in kind of what it does, and it does attack at a little bit of a different level than Sphere of Resistance does. I mean, in terms of how it's better, obviously Sphere of Resistance could prevent them from casting a particular spell, but Winter Orb might prevent them from casting more than 1 spell, or they may have to wait 2 or 3 turns before they can play that spell or a second spell again. So it's interesting. I personally, when it never really dawned on me that it was something that I could play in a Workshop deck. I looked on the Mana Drain, and I tried to find out if people in Vintage are playing it. Now it's a little bit different in Vintage because you have Moxen, and that's where Winter Orb in Classic shines. Obviously, if players are untapping only 1 land, but they've got 2 Mox in play, that's not that big of that's not, you know, that's not really a detriment. But in Classic, where people are depending on lands and the off chance that they might have a Sol Ring or a Mana Vault, you know, they don't have you know, permanents that produce mana for the most part, or at least they don't have nearly as many as a Vintage deck. So I think in Classic, in these next few months, Winter Orb is much more valuable than it will be once Vintage Match is released and we have Vintage online. But for the time being, I think I'm pretty happy with Winter Orb, and I think it's certainly something that we can explore more with workshop decks going forward. This is a workshop deck, so obviously we do want 4 Tangle Wire. There isn't any real reason to do that. It's kind of a non-bo with Winter Orb in the sense that while they have to untap only one of their lands, you might not get maximal value out of Tangle Wire, and even that, especially with the first or second turn that you play it. If it's still kind of in the first few turns, first 3 or 4 turns of the game, if you lead off with like a Winter Orb, they may have permanents already tapped for Tangle Wire, and you know they may only have 4 permanents on the battlefield. But if they can only untap one of their lands and 2 of their other lands are done, yeah, you can tap that that card, but it doesn't necessarily make a big difference. I mean, you do have to remember that you have to have an untapped card to be able to tap to Tangle Wire, so you're forced to really tap everything out. But like I said, the combination of the two don't really necessarily work well in tandem. So, you know, you're still gonna, you know, whatever you have to tap the Tangle Wire kind of takes precedence over, you know, how a Winter Orb works. But either way, it's still a really powerful card. There's no reason to play anything less than 4. So I've outlined the way for the deck to kind of both play a prison and a attrition based matchup, but how do we win? Knowing that this was going to be a much longer game plan, the first thing I threw out, which probably would never have been obvious to anybody, but to me it seemed to make a lot of sense, was Phyrexian Revoker. I don't want to be messing around my first few turns with a Revoker, especially if I get myself in a situation where I have to sacrifice it to a smokestack anyway. But mainly what Revoker, you know, what this deck lacks by not having Revoker is the ability to kind of shut off individual things, and that's something I missed in a couple of the games during the DE, but for the most part I think it worked out for the better, because what the deck doesn't be able to attack, or doesn't attack with two power guys, this deck slams much harder with bigger guys. So that involves obviously the singleton Lodestone Golem, but I have a pair of Wormcoil Engines, Steel Hellkite, and multiple Karn Silver Golem. So the reason why you want to use with Karn Silver Golem in this deck in particular is because Smokestack can attack for 4, and you can kind of put yourself in a situation if you want to throw away the Smokestack, but you still want to see if it has, you're still on the fence. You can use it as a 4 attacker, and that the same thing with Crucible Worlds. If you have multiple Crucible Worlds, you can make them 3/3s. And then Tangle Wires, as they are fading away, you can make those 3/3s as well. So that's the reason why Karn Silver Golem is pretty good, and he's pretty good at blocking. He becomes a 0/8. And every once in a while, especially against decks like Affinity, his second ability, or his one ability, I should say, making a non-creature artifact become an artifact, it can become relevant. And again, in the Affinity matchup, you can start wiping away some of the critical cards for them, like Opals and and things of that nature, so that there's some value to it. But in other matchups, you can use it to get rid of Lotus Petals. You can use it to kill your own Mana Crypt if it's killing you. It's got a lot of flexibility, and it's a nice ability to have in a pinch. And we also have a Singleton Batterskull. This deck does tend to kill itself a lot between the Ancient Tombs, Mana Crypt, and Fraction Metamorph. And you're going the long game. The lifelink of Batterskull is quite relevant. And in terms of the mana base, I mentioned before, we've got the full 8 Saw lands. We've got a full set of Wastelands. The other one is down here because we've got a mismatching set. Only thing I might change about this configuration is this Ghost Quarter. I only have 3 Mishra's Factories. I think I might want to switch that Ghost Quarter to the 4th factory, but it's a close call. I mean, it still has a lot of value. And then this deck has a couple of Mox Opals, and again, this kind of goes back to the reason why we have Winter Orb. In Vintage, like I mentioned, untapping because you have Moxen is not that big of a deal. But in Classic, nobody really has them. But the Mox Opal gives you kind of an additional boost for those Winter Orb turns. So if you do top deck a Wormcoil Engine or a Steel Hellkite or something like that, you can try and make maximal value out of that, because you can untap your Mishra's Workshop, use the Mox Opal mana, maybe play another land or something, play a 6-drop or a 4-drop with Lone Star Golem or something along those lines. The one last card I do want to mention off in the main deck is the Singleton Staff and Nim. It kind of goes well with Smokestack in the sense that it gives you more permanents to play. You're basically drawing 2 permanents a turn, and that's a huge advantage when you've got an active Smokestack and you're grinding away your opponent. The ability to ping 1 toughness guys, there's plenty of them in the Classic format, does have quite a bit of value, and I find it is kind of interesting that while Spirit of the Labyrinth shuts off the ability to draw a card, Staff and In by itself can turn around and ping the Spirit of Labyrinth. But nonetheless, it's a great card to have as a one-of. I wish I could fit 2 in the deck, but it's really difficult to take something out because the deck is pretty darn tight. I think maybe someone might think 4 Smokestacks is one too many. I wouldn't front you, or I wouldn't fault you for replacing 1 Smokestack with the 2nd Staff and In, but if there was one card I wanted to fit another copy of in this deck, it was Staff and In. So that's the main deck. This has already been a pretty long deck tech, but I'll just quickly go through the sideboard here. Obviously, Dredge is still a problem. It's actually a bigger problem now because you have less spheres, which means it's easier for them to cast their free spells, Cabal Therapy and Dread Return. So it's very important that after sideboard you can do something. So we have the full set of 4 Lelines and 4 Grafdigger's Cage. I've always been preferring Leline of the Void in Workshop decks, even though it is a dead card. It literally, after sideboard and Dredge matchups, is the only permanent that you can't cast. The only way you will ever be able to cast it is if you have a Mox Opal and you tap it for black mana, and you play a 2nd Mox Opal from your hand and play that for and tap that for black mana. Literally, that's the only way you are ever going to be able to cast a Leline of the Void. But I think it's imperative these days to play the Leline right off the bat for free, and make them have to remove it with a Nature's Claim or a Wisp-Mare, because those are basically the only ways they're getting rid of that card. They can also use a bounce spell. But at the end of the day, most of the decks are not playing. Most of the dredge decks are not playing bounce spells. They want to get rid of the permanent altogether. Affinity is obviously a tough matchup because this is a much slower deck. So I have 3 null rods in the sideboard. It's specifically for affinity. There really isn't any other use for it. I probably wouldn't bring it in even against blue decks unless they are the heavy Tezzeret style decks where they need Grim Monolith and whatnot in order to attack or to cast their spells. That would probably be the only deck I would bring it in against, other than Affinity. Against the creature decks in the meta game, which there are quite a few of them, the Triskelion is a great option to start pinging some of their guys, and even as a 4/4 guy for 6 mana, it's pretty good. Don't forget that if you get them down below 3 life by attacking with Triskelion, you can still, basically make your own lightning bolt and attack them. There was a game today where I got him down to an opponent down to 4, and I just couldn't kill him on the turn that I needed to on that turn. Otherwise, I would have won that game. And the last 2 cards here are Duplicate and Maze of Ith. I'm not really sold on the Maze of Ith. There are certain things that Maze of Ith is great against. Bladesteel Colossus at the top of the list, but there are certain other things like Trigon Predator, even a Tarmogoyf, things of that nature that it works against, but it's not a card that I am particularly a big fan of in the sideboard. But it's actually a holdover from what I originally based this deck off of, an old Smokestack deck. And it kind of stuck in the sideboard, but it does have a lot of value in those types of situations. Basically, those are the 2 chief cards that you really want to fight against. But there are other applications which come in handy from time to time. And then there's an extra duplicate in the sideboard for many different reasons. So that is the deck in a nutshell. This has already been a significantly long deck tech, but I think it's worth, even though everybody knows workshop decks, post the restrictions, I think it's worth going through a lot of the ideas and the thought process that I went through to try and come up with this deck. So I hope you enjoy the matches, and I look forward to hearing everybody's comments on the deck in the comment section.